Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce our very first plenary session titled Africa's Economic Transformation and Resilience, the next priorities. Like I mentioned earlier, we should be asking the right questions. What exactly are our next priorities as we focus on the theme of this summit? Now, it is essential to acknowledge the complex challenges facing African economies, from geopolitical conflicts and trade tensions to persistent financial constraints and, of course, climate-related risks. These forces have intensified vulnerabilities across the continent. They not only dampen economic prospects, but also create severe liquidity challenges, heighten macroeconomic instability, and add to an already overwhelming debt burden. Now, to explore these pressing issues further, we are fortunate and privileged to have an experienced and knowledgeable panel of experts alongside a skilled moderator who will guide us through this crucial conversation today. But just before I bring up our moderator, I'd like to crave your indulgence, very distinguished ladies and gentlemen, to please lend me your undivided attention as we invite our moderator up stage. Please kindly take your seats. Kindly take your seats very quickly, ladies and gentlemen. I'm bringing up our moderator, and I'd like that you please lend us your undivided attention as we get on this conversation. Our moderator is the Africa Executive Director at the One Campaign, a global advocacy organization dedicated to ending extreme poverty and preventable disease, particularly in Africa. It is my pleasure to make welcome on stage our moderator, Sarah Maka Ugbabe. A round of applause for Sarah as she comes up stage. She'll moderate this conversation. And again, we are asking that you please focus your attention to the stage and please lend us your undivided attention as we get on this conversation. To join her on this stage, it is my pleasure to make welcome on stage again the Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at the World Bank Group. One more time, let's make welcome on stage Indemit Jill. A round of applause for him as he comes up stage to join this conversation. Yes, we're truly honored to have you again. We cannot wait to hear from your wealth of knowledge and expertise alongside a sprinkle of humor. Thank you. Now, coming up next to join this panel, it is my pleasure to make welcome on stage the Vice President, Private Sector, Infrastructure and Industrialization, African Development Bank, Solomon Quaino. A round of applause as I make welcome on stage Solomon Quaino, who will join this conversation. Thank you very much. We also have the Group Chief Economist at Afrexim Bank, Yemi Kali. A round of applause as we make welcome Yemi Kali. This is a truly power-packed panel conversation, and I'm sure you're excited for the lineup already, but we aren't done yet. Also joining this conversation, we have the President and the Chief Executive Officer of the African Center for Economic Transformation. It is my pleasure to make welcome on stage Mavis Owusu Gyamfi, President CEO, African Center for Economic Transformation. Thank you very much. And last but not the least, to join them, we will wait for his arrival. Once he comes, the Honorable Minister for Planning, for Budget, beg your pardon, and Economic Planning. He will join this panel conversation. But in the meantime, I will hand over to our able moderator to stir this conversation from here. Over to you, ma'am.
Can you all hear me? Excellent. This is the room full of the resilient and the ones who will stay till the end. Good evening, everyone. It is good to have the first plenary. We are in between you and lunch or dinner, so we'll make this conversation dynamic and quick and get you to your next thing on the agenda. My name is Sarah Maka, as was introduced earlier, and we're having a conversation about Africa's economic transformation and resilience. Several speakers up here have said the way Nigeria goes will determine the way Africa goes. So we want to take a step back and pull it all the way back. How is Africa going? It seems that there has been a two bifurcated world, the world pre-COVID and the world post-COVID. In this world post-COVID, we have 20 African countries that are at risk of debt distress. And so when we think about the African economic transformation and the next priorities, we will focus on financing. Where is Africa's financing coming from? There are two main ways to focus on financing. The first is the source of financing, and very importantly, the use of financing. For this conversation, however, we'll rest on the sources of financing. I'll read a few statistics. The financing gap for Africa is $402 billion. And we are seeing countries like Nigeria not only devalue its currency by about 70%, but also have it as raging inflation. We see Ghana has the highest inflation in the last 20 years at about 33 or so percent. So we know that there is a fiscal crunch. And Dermot, I wanted to start with your speech. You kind of took us on a roller coaster speech. I don't know if you guys will agree. We started low, kind of tried to go high, and then you plummeted us low again to the fact that the needs of Nigeria will require that sustained 10 to 15%. The murmur you heard in the crowd was not a murmur of disagreement. It was a murmur of slight disbelief, or can we really get there? I'll throw the first question to you to open us up. As you look around the world as the chief economist of the World Bank, how are you seeing the needs of financing play out in many countries? And in particular, for real people in real places, because sometimes we can have a sense that we have a conversation about statistics and numbers, and we lose the people. So how are you seeing this need for financing play out in real places for real people?
So two or three things. So the first one is that when you look at the growth prospects of countries around the world, because growth is what actually attracts private investment, it's what actually attracts foreign direct investment and so on. The growth prospects are not particularly strong in most countries. So
You're welcome.
So they're relatively weak in the advanced economies now. So roughly speaking, outside of the United States, if you look at growth rates, they have about halved compared to the first decade of this millennium, right? From about 2% to about less than 1%. When it comes to emerging markets, like India, like Indonesia, Nigeria, and so on, you see the same thing. With some, now in each case there are some exceptions. In the case of advanced economies, the big exception is the United States, because it still continues to power. When it comes to emerging markets, unfortunately the exceptions don't include Nigeria. Nigeria's growth prospects have been going down too. But there are a few bright spots like India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on. China's growth rates have also come down, but that's because of success, not failure. You know? And then the most worrying countries are the low-income countries. The low-income countries have lost a whole decade. They have had no growth rate. They have, and those are the countries that we worry about the most. There are about 2-3 dozen countries, and they have lost a decade, and they will go there. But let's focus on countries like Nigeria. Countries like Nigeria are what we call middle-income countries. And middle-income countries have never had it easy. So we just finished a report called the middle-income trap, right? This is a very real phenomenon in the sense that countries, if you look at the typical middle-income country and you look at their per capita income in 1970 and look at their per capita income today, it is roughly the same share as that of the United States. They have not caught up at all. There are a few exceptions like China, now India is catching up and so on. But they have their per capita incomes are a fraction. So these countries have to do a lot in order to become the attractors of foreign direct investment, the attractors of domestic investment too, because private investment has been falling across the world. So they have to make a big, big change. Now, the second question that you asked me earlier, you said, but what about international finance? Where, you know, there are these big big demands. We need, according to one estimate, that $3 trillion more per year needed.
Correct.
When you look at that, and you look at that more closely, you find that the people who come up with these numbers, they said there should be $3 trillion more for developing countries other than China. 2 trillion of this should come from the countries themselves, higher taxes and things like that. So we're talking about 1 trillion now coming from international sources. Then when you look at that a little bit more closely, half of that should come from the private sector, somewhat miraculously. Out of the other half, more than half of the rest will be debt creating international flows from places like the African Development Bank and the World Bank and so on. And it turns out that a lot of these countries are already very heavily debt laden, so they can't actually take on more debt. So basically, at the end of it, I think that if you look at the experience of the successful countries, they took matters into their own hand. They were not looking abroad for money and so on. They self-financed their growth and so on. So the sort of discussions that we are having here today at the NESG are exactly the right ones. We're talking about what can the government do for the private sector? What can the private sector do for the people? But we are talking about Nigeria, we are talking about this region. We are not talking about some expected big flow of money that is going to come. If you take care of all of these things, that's what we find from countries like South Korea and so on. If you're open, you remain open to these flows, that money will come too. But that should not be, that should be almost like a byproduct of the reforms. It should not be the primary product.
That's excellent. 2/3 of what we need in trillions should come from the countries. Minister, before you walked in, we talked about the fact that there are about 20 countries on the continent at risk of debt distress. The question is for Nigeria, what is the scale of the needs, the financial needs for Nigeria to help us navigate this set of reforms that are challenging but necessary for the country? So what is the scale of need? And can you share a little bit of the reforms that are in play as we speak?
Thank you. And maybe I missed out on the introductory part, and I'm standing in for the coordinating minister of the economy, Wale Edu, who sent his apologies and is unavoidably absent. But in terms of the reforms, maybe a lot of it have been discussed earlier, so rather than focusing on that, safe to say that, I will save some time, safe to say that the main thrust of the reform, the Renewed Hope agenda strategy, is that we are not where we want to be. We have an Agenda 2050 document where we forecast to be at 33,000 per capita GDP. And so at the rate we are growing, that may not be achievable.
Correct.
And decades of underinvestment have affected all our, both our security, our infrastructure, and human capital development. And the realization is, what are the choices before us? How can we mobilize our populace behind a set of agreeable consensus that will generate growth at a rate near double digit as possible? So in terms of how much investment capital we need is to generate growth near double digit or near double digit as possible, and stay the course. I think it has been said. Earlier on, and since both constitutionally and strategically we are a market economy, we wanted to ensure that we create the framework where private sector is able to mobilize the resources that are needed. The Agenda 2050 forecasted that we should be investing at least $100 billion per annum in order to achieve that goal, with 14% of it coming from the public sector and 86% from the private sector. That is the kind of ambition we have, and we still believe that there is money out there, there is an international capital out there. International engagement that Mr. President had led himself further gave us the optimism that we need to invest in the skill set that is necessary to mobilize or to support the private capital in mobilizing that capital. When I say private capital, including PPP, infrastructure, and energy supportive investment.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. 86% from the private sector and 14% from the public sector at 100 billion per year. Solomon, I'd like to bring you in. The Honorable Minister, our chief host, and I think NESG is such a great marriage between the public sector and the private sector, because that's the way forward. Can you talk to us about the private sector's contribution to Africa's needs to drive this economy to better resilience?
No, thank you very much, Sarah. I mean, we've heard the numbers. You know, if we even look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which is what we are all trying to achieve by 2030, almost 8 years ago, we said that the gap would be $1.3 trillion per annum for Africa to achieve this. And we know Africa is already behind on the SDGs. You know, if you also, you know, take, and I'm looking at this in the African context broadly, and, you know, I've just heard from the minister talk about $600 billion a year, of which, you know, 14%, only 14% can be provided by the public sector. We also have limited fiscal space in our governments in an extraordinary manner as a result of COVID, as a result of high food and energy prices. I want to set the context before I respond to your question. So with all of that in mind, yes, the numbers are huge. We could collapse before the numbers and say that there's nothing we can do to achieve these numbers. But I hope the numbers actually tells us about the importance of having to have a partnership between public and private of a nature that we haven't seen before. It's only in this context that we can actually create the right environment for private sector. And I could talk about, you know, financing for private sector. But for private sector, first of all, capital flows to the environments that really incentivize private sector to thrive. Okay. So we're not going to see the capital flows to Nigeria. We're even going to see the capital outflows from Nigeria to other markets. I mean, I was in Lagos, you know, 2 days ago. I was talking to a packaging company that's now doing about, you know, 50% of its business in the rest of Africa. Yeah. So private sector is going to flow unless we actually pay attention to the public-private dialogue that we're having here as a result of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. It was great to actually listen to, you know, the past dawns of the NESG, you know, talking before, because nothing beats creating the appropriate business environment. And I could give you almost a checklist, you know, yes, you know, they have to be the right laws, they have to be the right regulations, they have to be the right policies, there has to be the right infrastructure, but it's not a checklist approach. It's really about business confidence. Okay. So if we don't create the business confidence, and the business confidence comes really in terms of what people understand that the government wants to achieve, you know, in a very planned manner. You can make tough reform decisions, but if you don't really create that whole conducive environment, you're not going to see private sector thrive. And let's even be honest, when it comes to African private sector, 90% of them are small and medium enterprises. So what we need to be thinking about is how do we also create the right environment for SMEs to thrive? And these SMEs travel. These SMEs would actually go regional, when that opportunity comes. So I guess for me, first of all, it's more create the right conducive environment for private sector to thrive. Those of us who invest and finance in private sector would comfortably come along. Yeah? So yes, in the case of AFDB, the African Development Bank, when it comes to the transformational infrastructure projects, there are ways in which we can support that. We've done that in Nigeria. We've provided a partial risk guarantee to NBET, the single power buyer, to actually encourage private sector IPPs like Azura. We provided a 200 million partial risk guarantee. In several other African countries, we've provided what we call credit enhancements for the governments to actually go and issue, bonds on the, international capital markets. And, yes, so we can bring capital in for government to actually play their part in public-private partnerships. But if private sector is actually going to, thrive, Honorable Minister, one of my pleas for you is the message we heard at the beginning, which is Africa goes as far as Nigeria. The most critical treaty, at least in my lifetime, that can be a game changer is the African Continental Free Trade Area. The European Union did not come together because it was nice to have. It came together because it realized that as an economic bloc, it's going to really be competitive with other, continental markets. We need your leadership as Nigeria to make the African Continental Free Trade Area work. That's the game changer for private sector. So when I gave you the example of a packaging company actually, doing 40% exports, it would even be better if we actually had the African Continental Free Trade Area with the right political leadership working. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Solomon. The Continental Free Trade Area has been transformative indeed and has a long way to go. Africa is still trading within itself only 15%. Compare that with how much Africa is trading with China, a singular country, 40%. Compare that with what Africa is trading with the EU, about a little under 40%. So amongst ourselves, we're only trading 15%. Yemi, with the Afri-Exim Bank, trade financing, I'd like to bring you in. How are you seeing the Afri-Exim Bank improve that trade amongst the continent, countries within the continent, and particularly, how do you see the trade financing coming into the fiscal space that we're seeing many African countries going through?
Well, firstly, there's a saying that never waste an opportunity of a good crisis. I think that is one of the things that we're seeing recently, the challenges that the African economy has been facing since the COVID-19 pandemic, all the geopolitical tensions and repositionings, all the supply chain disruptions, the difficulties that that has created, the withdrawal of capital, the difficulties that it has created for African countries to trade with their historical trading partners, actually forcing them to look inwards and trade more among themselves. So that's one positive development. Actually, if you look at the data, you'll find that intra-African trade actually has almost doubled over the last 10 or 15 years. So there has been improvement, but it's still significantly less than where we want to go. So what do we do here? We, first of all, try to understand the impediments for greater intra-African trade. Firstly, we observe that the goods that African countries export and the goods that they import. So most African countries were importing goods that are not naturally available domestically in the continent in enough quantities. So what the Afrexim Bank would do is to support that by financing domestic industries, support that backward integration so that you look at the list of what is being imported from outside Africa, and then you try and create the environment so that it can be produced domestically within Africa. So rather than Nigeria going to China or the US to import something, it can actually just import it from Cameroon immediately. And that's is a good, it's interesting that we talked about the African continental free trade area. It's actually we did a study and we observed that it has dual roles in boosting economic growth development for the continent, but it also has significant benefits for climate change because it is, in terms of emissions, it is, you emit a lot less if you are importing from Nigeria is importing from Ghana rather than importing from the US. So you have a situation where we can pursue our development goals without hurting the climate, actually improving it. The second thing we did was we observed that one of the bottlenecks as far as intra-African trade is concerned, improving intra-African trade is concerned, was transportation networks, inadequate infrastructure. So you are here, so what we do is we go in and try to support financially the development of infrastructure to ensure that it's easier to move trade from within African countries and across African countries. We observed that another obstacle was payment systems. So if I want to purchase something from Ghana, I would have to look for dollars to do so. And that didn't exist, and that inhibited intra-African trade. So, of course, we developed the Pan-African payment system so that I don't have to look for dollars to trade with Ghana. I can just swap Naira with cedis, and that will increase the flow of intra-African trade. We observed information gaps. So you find that in certain African countries, they don't even know what other African countries are producing. That information doesn't exist. So we provide a platform where we know the strengths of other African countries. We understand what they're actually producing. And we find out that a lot of the things that we want to import can actually be found around within the continent. And once we have that information, we can encourage improvement in trading. We found also that even when businesses knew what other African countries were producing, there's this lack of trust. Am I sure that the person I'm going to trade in Cameroon, the business I'm talking to in Cameroon is genuine? So we created, again, a platform where Afreximbank would validate and authenticate the trading partner, thereby giving a bit more comfort to African businesses to trade with one another. So all these different things, we think that with the continuous implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, we'll see a situation where the very little share of intra-African trade will actually improve going forward. So we're actually quite optimistic. We are seeing growth in Africans trading with themselves, and we expect that trend to continue.
Excellent. Thank you, Yemi. I know there's a legendary green book that has solutions. So we are circling around the continental free trade area and the opportunity that has for Nigeria alongside other African countries to both increase financing and promote industrialization. Mavis, I wanted to bring you in at the African Center for Economic Transformation. I mean, the title of your think tank actually embodies the conversation we're in. Many advocacy organizations like yours, like mine, like the NESG, have been working around the global financial architecture because globally, this has implications for financing on the continent. Can you tell us why that global financial architecture is important? And with your hat as the think tank for economic transformation, what's your take on where Nigeria is today and where she ought to be, especially for that green book?
Okay. Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, NESG, for the invitation. So to the first part of your question, why does the global financial architecture matters, and its reform in particular? Let's remember when the global financial architecture was first created. It was created at a time when actually Nigeria was not independent. There wasn't a country like Nigeria. Most of Africa were colonies. It was created at a time when women could not vote. Today, women can vote. And yet, despite all the changes that has happened in the world thus far, All that we've seen with the global financial architecture has been tweaks. There's been small tweaks every 5 or 6 years when organizations like mine, yours, NESG make some noise, they tweak it a bit and we move on. What we're saying now is that it's not good enough. It's just not good enough to tweak it. It needs a major overhaul. So last year, a group of African finance ministers came together and they said to the leaders of these financial institutions, we need 5 things. We need a better framework for debt restructuring. So we need to be able to have a financing facility we can go to when we have a liquidity crisis. And when we then, unfortunately, if we become insolvent, we need an organization we can go to. The common framework, it's not common. Anybody who's seen Africa's debt restructuring will tell you it's far from common. Ghana went one way, Zambia went another, Ethiopia is going to go another. So we need to either overhaul the common framework or improve it substantially. We talked about needing more concessional finance. Concessional finance is important. It's important because it enables countries to make those difficult investments that it's difficult to spend tax money on. So getting more concessional finance is critical. The leaders talked about the importance of financing for green industrialization. We've heard a lot about the fact that Africa needs to diversify its economies. We sit on 60% of the raw materials, be it wind, solar, minerals, yet we have 1% of skills, 1% of technology, barely 3% of finance. You know, the world is not going to achieve its climate objectives if this continues. And then the final thing they asked for is they wanted a seat at the decision-making table. They gave us the AU, great. They've given us an extra seat at the IMF, great. We still don't think enough. We need the quoted shares changed. And of course, there's a bit of onus on us as Africans to make sure that the AU uses that seat effectively. We can't just go and sit there. And so, as I'm sitting here in front of Minister, African governments need to finance the AU to have a focused unit for the G20. It can't do it by just adding it to the work of existing groups within the AU Commission. It just won't work. But let's come to my favorite topic, Africa transformation. Last year, we released our Africa Transformation Index, and it was really depressing to see that Africa is actually regressing on economic transformation. So our index covers 5 areas: diversification, export competitiveness, productivity, technology, and human well-being. Across the board, we have dropped on diversification. Of course, that means most countries have fallen on economic export competitiveness. But as Indemet earlier said, there is no country that has developed on the back of international concessional finance. It's been developed on the back of domestic resource mobilization and the private sector. So firstly, we need to do a much better job of utilizing our African financial institutions, the AFDB, Afri-Exim being 2 examples of over 150 financial institutions that we have on this continent. We need to do a much better job of supporting them to collaborate and leverage. That's the first thing. The second thing is that countries need to be intentional about diversifying their economies. You know, Indemet stood up earlier and said Nigeria needs to invest in diversification beyond oil. What does it mean in practice? It's a strap line. We need to be intentional. We need to pick a specific sector and say we're going to invest in this sector and drive it over the next, yes, I'm going to say 10 to 15 years. So, Minister, let me give you one sector. We are sitting in a continent where we import a lot of inputs for our production. Most of this input is machinery, okay? Nigeria is sitting on a population of 220 people and asking, where are the jobs of the future? Why is Nigeria not producing the machinery that Africa needs to add value to its raw material? So, currently, Nigeria is a net importer of tractors. and it imports it mostly from China, America, a few other places. Interestingly, Nigeria also exports tractors, and its largest markets are Benin, Niger, and Angola. So why doesn't Nigeria say that from now on, we are going to be the manufacturers of tractors for the African continent? And we are going to export tractors to the rest of the continent. It achieves three things. One, you start to diversify your economy beyond oil. Two, you create the jobs that you desperately need for your rapidly growing young population. Three, you reduce the cost of value addition production on the African continent. And finally, you lay the foundation to move into other machinery on the continent. Everybody has said Africa cannot transform without Nigeria. Nigeria cannot transform without looking beyond its boundaries. Nigeria needs to think local, but act regional. And as a child of Ghana, to sit here and say, we need Nigeria to grow, it tells you a lot about how important this great country is. Thank you.
Thank you, Mavis. Honorable Minister, Chief Host, Co-host, may I put you on the spot, please, and ask for your reaction to what she just offered?
I think earlier to that, there was a comment that Nigeria should lead the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area also. And now, but it goes to the heart of the issue, one heart of the issue, maybe of the topic, in the sense that earlier in the year, there was a meeting here of what is known as the African Caucus, where the coordinating minister of the economy, Wale Edu, who is the chairman of the African Caucus of Finance Ministers, met, and among other issues, discussed this issue of financial architecture and Africa pre-continental free trade area. And in a tangential manner, what she raised, why can't Nigeria, and they are all interlinked in the sense that African countries are competing with each other rather than complementing each other, even though international diplomacy have sort of treated them as one country, because we are seeing Russia-Africa Forum, we are seeing Saudi-Africa, China-Africa Forum. But in between ourselves, we are still competing with each other with different trade policies, with different non-helpful measures that even what you describe as a simple exercise of why can't Nigeria produce and sell tractors to the rest of the continent may be constrained by the fact that there are tractor manufacturers around the world who are supported by governments who distort international trade, who despite World Trade Organization, and that is maybe a fundamental part of the challenge, despite the existence of World Trade Organization, are using muscles supported by their government to distort international trade and the ability for our countries such as ours to produce goods competitively and market them elsewhere. Even where those attempts were done, typically they were done as part of import substitution drives, because in Nigeria we had the experience of Peugeot and Volkswagen in the 70s and 80s. Most of them were supported in order to meet the Nigerian market, not to support Nigeria's industrialization. So that's a dream, and we believe the African Free Trade Agreement, Continental Free, provides the platform. And then the reform of or rather, generating an irreducible minimum of consensus with which African leaders collectively can carry the messaging, and it's evolving. I was at the South-South Summit in Kampala, and I accompanied Mr. President to the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. It is being increasingly recognized that they have to say it simply. They have to draw attention to the global inequity, particularly in the capital market. And when we are talking about financial architecture reform, we should maybe also be focusing on the evolution of the financial architecture, because if one is talking about the World Bank, IMF that were created as sitting atop, from that period in 1945 to date, the capital market, what is available elsewhere, is vastly comparable to what is available to the developmental institutions. So what maybe we need help with is what kind of skill set do we need to evolve so that African countries can be able to access long-term funding at the scale and tenure that are available to other countries in Latin America, in East Africa, and it brings to mind a comment by President Bill Clinton when he addressed our National Assembly in the year 2000, where he said, before coming, he met with African American leaders, and he asked them, what do you want, what should I tell the Nigerians? And he said, one of the leaders, African American leaders, told him that, tell them that the World Bank does not have the balance sheet to support their developmental. It is Wall Street then and Silicon Valley. But so we need to even widen the discourse rather than just articulating how to put pressure. Maybe the World Bank, IMF, the United Nations system, we can put pressure on them to move to ways of de-risking countries in the global south so that they can be able to access the trillions of dollars that are in capital markets equitably, competitively.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, for that charge. And Demet, you are right in the bullseye. You are the object of our advocacy to increase our balance sheet. I can see that we are running out of time, so I'm going to turn to you first to give us the closing thoughts. And here's the guidings. Who needs to do what by when? In the priority of getting more financing to the continent, improving the equity of the global financial architecture that has been biased against countries that weren't on the table when they were created. So let's say we show up on Monday morning. What's your advice? Who needs to do what by when? And I'm going to ask my entire panel. I think for the audience, it's interesting that we have two people from the public sector, quasi. The World Bank is here. Our Honorable Minister of Budget and Planning is here. We have two people from the private sector, quasi. The African Development Bank is here. The Afri-Exim Bank is here. And we have two people from the social sector. African Center for Economic Transformation is here, and the One Campaign is here. So the three of us truly are a microcosm of society. So Indermit, the floor is yours.
Yes. So out of all of the comments that I heard here, the ones that I liked the most was those of the minister. And I'm not sucking up to my host. So I actually did think that he actually touched upon a very important issue. So when you talk about the global financial architecture or global governance system or something, there are three sort of pillars of it, right? There might have been a fourth, but the three big ones are the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO. Now, over time, what has happened, especially over the last decade or so, people seem to have or they seem to think that the WTO is not necessary. Now, it may not be necessary for the G20 countries. They have 85% of the world's GDP, and they're actually imposing a lot of restrictions on trade and so on. But it really matters a lot for the other 180 countries that have about 15% of the world's GDP, and they should have more. China, suppose Nigeria is included in one of them. So I think one of the things that countries like Nigeria and all ought to do is to sort of say, how do we rebuild the WTO that is fit for purpose? And it has to be built that way, because right now, part of the problem there is the fact that you actually have a multilateral organization like the WTO, but countries unilaterally define whether they are developed or developing. So countries like China continue to define themselves as developing, even though they, by many accounts, at least when it comes to manufacturing, trade, finance, and so on, they should not necessarily be in the same category as Canada, but they should not be in the same category as Nigeria either.
Sure.
Okay, so that's the first one. Now, the second part, of course, is that the IMF and the World Bank need to step up on this one. So in this case, for example, I think that part of the reason for the scapegoating of the WTO is the fact that when China joined the WTO, what happened was that the World Bank and the IMF didn't do their job at that time. They should have done their job. They should have made sure that China didn't undervalue its currency systematically for 8, 9, 10 years. That resulted in a loss of jobs that was much more rapid than it would have been otherwise. There would have been a loss of job in places like the US anyway. It was much more rapid as a result of the fact that China had an undervalued currency. And the loss of these jobs, they were from places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. You keep hearing about these states again and again in every election now, for a good reason. It's for that reason. The third thing that the World Bank also cheerled, we kept saying, oh, China is reducing poverty like crazy. This is fantastic. This is fantastic. We did not look more closely to sort of see that there were the ways that they were doing. They were muddling public and private resources and so on. And as a result of that, it put a lot of strain on the trading system overall. That needs to be rethought. And all three of these organizations, if they all do their job, countries like Nigeria, countries like Ghana and all have half a chance. Okay?
Excellent.
Otherwise, no. One last thing. The point that Mavis mentioned, I mean, I disagree with her on just one detail, which is, maybe for a small economy, it's fine to sort of think about, well, should I develop this particular sector or that particular sector? But for a large economy like Nigeria, for a large economy like India and so on, you should not be thinking narrowly about sectors. You should not be thinking vertically. You shouldn't be saying, should I do this agro-processing part, or should I do this sliver of manufacturing, or what you should be really looking at things much more horizontally and say, should I be trying to create a digital infrastructure that everybody can use? Should I be trying to make a physical infrastructure that everybody can use? Should I be trying to do a tax reform that leads to much more fluid movement between the different states in places like Nigeria, places like India, and so on? Should we be doing a massive push on education? Should we be trying to figure out a way to increase economic freedom for everybody, regardless of it? Take a look at Nigeria. Take a look at India. These countries are lagging in economic freedom. Once they do that, and they still don't find that investment is not coming, etc., because they are too small, because something else matters, then fine, then do the things. But before that, fix economic freedom.
So the sequential.
One last thing.
Sequential.
One last thing. So you say, okay, well, economic freedom, well, this takes a long time, you're talking more generally, what does economic diversification mean, etc., etc. Take a look at Vietnam. Look at what they did. Vietnam and India were ranked the same 5 years ago on economic freedom. Today, Vietnam is ranked much, much higher. What did they do in 5 years? Figure it out. Okay? I can give you the answers to it.
But let's take a look.
But that would encourage laziness. I think it would be good.
There's a homework for us. Honorable Minister, we'll come to you last, and you'll have the final word. Solomon, can I call up to you? Endemic told us World Bank, IMF, WTO, they are the targets of our advocacy on push. For you, what should we do Monday morning? Who should we target and by when?
Okay, so let me probably just make one more statement on the African Continental Free Trade Area, because I'm going to appear to disagree and also support what Mavis said.
It's welcome.
When I asked for leadership by Nigeria in the CFTA, it was more from a signaling effect. If Nigeria decides to really produce in all value chains and essentially does import substitution, it destroys really the whole aegis of a single continental free trade area. First of all, it's not about import substitution, and secondly, we have to really focus on the value chains in which we are competitive. So Nigeria should only focus on the value chains in which it's competitive. So if, for example, Ethiopia is competitive in terms of wheat production, then Nigeria should be importing wheat. I did see Boye is here, so you can import wheat, Boye, from Ethiopia. And even Sudan, because we've actually seen them transform, their wheat and, their wheat culture. So I just think it's important that we keep that in mind. And we've also heard about the Airbus model. We also need to think about the Airbus model and regional value chains, because there can't only be one winner when it comes to the CFTA. So that's what I wanted to say very quickly on that. Look, in terms of the global financial architecture, I think Mavis, and my colleague from the World Bank have covered it well. But one of the things that we're trying to do to bring in the right resources to support Africa, especially in things like climate adaptation, where you don't really generate revenues, is something called special drawing rights. We're trying to get, the most powerful countries to really, pledge these assets to us as AFDB, just really up to about 20 billion. We can leverage that 4 times. And we can even use that to help, capitalize and fund the likes of AfriExim and other African development finance institutions as a system. Yeah? So yes, but my story is the domestic story, and that's what I'm going to leave you with. Africa, assets under management, institutional investors, pension funds, insurance companies, is estimated at $2.3 trillion. Let us work on finding a way to channel that into the productive sector, into the infrastructure space. We control that. This is savings by Africans. First of all, Demola from Stanbic IBTC in his presentation talked about it. The penetration is even low. Let's create the enabling environment for that saving product to really significantly, quintuple, okay? So for me, Nigeria is a great ground for pilots. And Nigeria has actually demonstrated how to channel those institutional assets into the productive sector. I'll just give you some quick examples. Infra Credit, Nigeria. This is a monoline credit guarantee agency that to date has credit wrapped about $300 million worth of infrastructure investments. It's 300 million only because of the exchange rate. The truth is, it should be about 4 times that, yeah? So this is Nigerian pension funds really working for Nigeria. We also, so we've invested in that. We've invested in the Nigeria Infrastructure Development Fund as well. We've invested in the ARM Harith infrastructure funds. This is where we're actually channeling African private capital, institutional capital, into the industrial sector. So for me, this is my aim. We've replicated InfraCredit now in East Africa. We're doing it on a regional basis. We're going to do this in Francophone Africa. We're going to do this really across Africa so we can mobilize our domestic savings, because that is what we can control.
That advocacy is to the private sector, $2.3 trillion. The gap currently is $420 billion. So there's a lot more money out there in the private sector. Yemi, what should we do?
We have less than a minute to go, so I'll just keep it very, very short. And obviously, I agree completely with the AFDB. And I think in addition to what he said, all the other sources of private capital, I think there's a need to harness the power of the diaspora. I think there's a huge amount of resources out there. It's one of the areas where we don't pay a lot of attention to. When I travel around the world and we meet with whether it's Nigerians or Africans in diaspora, they're trying to reconnect back with the continent. They're not really sure how to do it. But we're not paying attention to all those huge sources of capital out there. I think we need to be looking at how to create financial instruments that take into consideration their fares, their specific needs, so we can attract that capital into the continent, not just in terms of remittances. I know remittances are quite important. Is estimated about $50 billion annually. That's a lot, but that's not all it is. They bring in remittances, they bring in huge other capital, sources of capital, they bring in expertise. And they are more consistent and sustainable. So I think in addition to all these other areas, that's one heavily untapped, huge source of capital. And I think that's something that we need to be looking at. So if you ask me, who do we talk to next? I would say the capital is there for Africa. At Afrexim Bank, we don't look at Africa in terms of the geographical boundaries. We look at it with the context, with the concept of global Africa. So that includes Africans living in the continent, as well as Africans outside the continent, whether they left voluntarily, the so-called Japa people, or they were forcefully removed decades ago. That's our concept of Africa, and that's the people we believe we can connect with, speak with one voice, unified, and pull those resources for the development of the continent. I think that's all I would add to what the EFDB has very well articulated.
Excellent. There's a distinction there, not just the Africans in Obodo Oyibo, but those also on the continent. How do we harness their funds? Mavis, who do we need to advocate to and by when?
So, two things. The first one is, Solomon, thank you. I'd like to say I disagree with Indomet because the challenge is complex and we need to start somewhere. So, Minister, my ask was for us to start somewhere, because for Nigeria to do it, it's about stealing and borrowing the technology. It's about building the skills. It's about building the infrastructure. There's a lot to be done. If Nigeria can crack it in one area, it lays the foundations of building on. Otherwise, we constantly have these big ambitions that we then say, time is up, we haven't done it. So just to push back on that slightly. What do we do tomorrow morning? I say we get up with the slogan, collaborative action for growth, competitiveness, and stability. And the reason collaboration is important goes back to the point that Honorable Minister said. Geopolitics, despite everything it says, is not in favor of Africa right now. In fact, it's afraid of Africa waking up, okay? Which means Africa needs to collaborate. It's about being intentional, Honorable Minister, you and your peers working together to stand up against the tyrants that are in the world that are saying, no, you cannot produce these tractors, you must import it. Why are they any better than us? We are starting from a low base. So collaboration across countries, collaboration between government and business, collaboration should underpin everything. And that takes me to, I'd like to endorse what Solomon said. We have money on this continent. We spend a lot of time looking out for the money without focusing enough on how we unlock the money within this continent. So the second thing I'm saying is, Sarah, tomorrow we need to start talking about unlocking the money on this continent. That's the second thing we need to do. And just finally, I'd just like to leave with one point. Look, the Vice President said earlier on that Nigeria and Africa has a challenge. It's true. We have a big challenge. A challenge is a problem that can be solved. You know, it's like trying to build a bridge. It's hard work. It can be solved, okay? So we've got to focus on dealing with the challenge and not getting lost in the sense of complexity. Because complexity is cancer. We don't know how to cure it, okay? A challenge is the problem we have. It's a bridge. We know how to build it. We need to work together, and we need to focus and be intentional on building the bridge, irrespective of what the world is saying. If we can't do it amongst ourselves, trust me, nobody is coming to do it for us.
Thank you, Mavis. Honorable Minister, you have the final word.
Okay.
And I know that you might not be without areas you need to advocate for as well. So who do you need to speak with on Monday morning, whether on the global financial architecture, with advocates, the private sector, and what do we need to do by when?
Thank you. Well, I think the NESG have given us guidance on what is possible, because part of what we had in the NESG story is here is private sector and public sector coming together to agree even difficult reforms and communicate them as such and seek support. I remember I didn't have the opportunity to contribute then. 30 years ago, I was a special assistant to Kalu Idika Kalu, who was then Nigeria's Minister of Finance, and Hakim Bello Osaigi and a group bought UBA. And it was, to the old guard, it was really a shocker. How can, and they proposed to us a golden shares decree where government would own one share, but that can make the government determine the decision. And late Ama Iwagu, Senator Ama Iwagu, and I were special assistants to the minister, so we are asked to do the memo. And of course, we met with, among others, Dick Kramer, Mohammed Hayatuddin, and we are able to convince that this is reckless. So it was a shock then. Today is common. You have Tony Elemeluz, you have Jim Obias taken on the world. So maybe seizing on that, if we have an Africa Economic Summit group, where African private sector and government can simplify and generate consensus that we can encourage political leaders to unite behind, because there are those common challenges, whether it is WTO or developmental institutions or even private capital. Maybe it will help resolve issues quickly and we can support each other more. I remember at the African Caucus meeting that took place, one frustrated African finance minister was giving the story of how for the last 7 years he has been trying to understand the credit rating, what do they use? How is it that he can't do better?
Yeah.
And so to the extent that there was talk of let's even create our own African rating agency so that we can create our own story. And one can see, yes, that's one way. And both Mabel and the AFD, I'm not, the examples in the banking sector, in cement manufacturing, in oil trading, show that even as imperfect as things are, we can do some things. Yeah. But I thought what we are saying going forward, how can we generate that growth? So collaboration between African countries supported by forums such as this that can bring trust and reduce it to simple consensus that can be adopted by countries and even African diaspora, maybe will help us push the agenda and get those changes that will support the implementation of African continental free, which, as you very well know, is a free-trade area that is competing with other free-trade areas. And we see how even Germany and France, despite their doggedness to support the European Union, how they also did say what they were doing it at a great risk. So for the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to work, maybe it can benefit from consensus generation and support to give momentum to political leaders.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, it was here at the 30th NESG that the Africa Economic Summit Group was birthed. I need the green book to capture that as well. You'll have to agree it's been a phenomenal panel, so please give a round of applause to my panel members. Thank you all for this conversation. And I think we'll just stand over there, get a picture, and we'll be ready to move on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Chairman and the co-chair, please join them here. Mr. Nannaude, please. All right, please join us.